I'm Becky Goldsmith with Piece of Cake, and I want to show you how to turn an outer point if you sew vertically toward yourself. I am about 3/16 of an inch, the width of a seam allowance, away from the inside edge of my chalk line at the outer point. I'm going to pull the camera in just a little bit here so you can see better what I'm doing. When I am about 3/16 of an inch away from the inside edge of the chalk line that marks the other side of this point, I'm going to shorten my stitch length. So my stitches that were more than 1/16 of an inch apart are going to tighten up here to be much closer to 1/16 of an inch apart. The reason you want to shorten your stitch length is because when the seam allowance is turned under on the second side of this point, there will be bulk underneath here that pushes up against the top side of the applique. And if your stitches are too far apart, it'll bubble up between, this edge will bubble up between the stitches and it won't look very good. Now, before you turn the work in your hand, you want to do a tack stitch here. Now, what I mean by that is this. I'm going to put my needle in as if I were starting another stitch, but instead I'm going to turn and come up through the beginning of that stitch. It's as if I'm doing a stitch in place. Oop, I think I've got a little cat hair there. Alright, so I've got a stitch in place right there. Now what that does is keep these stitches from getting loose as I manipulate the seam allowance under on the second side of the point. Now I'm going to park my needle and turn my applique in my hand. I'm going to remove the pin. I've got a little bit of a dog ear sticking out beyond the end of this beyond the edge of this side of the leaf. I can cut that off even or not. I would advise you never to reach underneath here with your scissors and blindly cut away fabric that you can't see. Now, because you are sewing toward yourself, in case you watched the movie for folks who stitch from right to left with the horizon, there's a maneuver in that movie that you can do if you sew from right to left. But if you're sewing this direction, you can't do that, so don't even try. What you'll do next is take your dampened toothpick, and I always dampen my toothpick as I'm getting ready to use it because it raises the grain of the wood on the toothpick, which makes it grab the fabric better. I'm going to put my toothpick at the end of this point and gently fold that seam allowance under. If any of the excess fabric at the point has gotten pulled underneath with that, I would take the thread and pull it out in the direction of the point. Now, there are two ways you can do this. Let me back this up so that you can see my hand better. One is to place the toothpick here, and it's like a windshield wiper motion. I can take this and move the fabric under just like that, and that works remarkably well. But if you can't quite make your fingers do that, you can come at it from the other side. Now let me bring it in just a little bit closer. You can also bring your toothpick in here, place the point of the toothpick at the point of the leaf, and bring it in this way. Stroke it in. Now, let me show you the first way a little closer. So I've got my toothpick here. It's next to the edge of the applique, and I'm going to roll that under. And if I do that, then I'm going to reach underneath with the toothpick, and anything that might have gotten bunched up underneath there, I'm going to sweep away from the point. I'm going to re-dampen my toothpick and move it in here. And then sweep anything that might have gotten bunched up away. Every now and then I'll give the thread at the end of the point a tug. Now to go back to the other direction, if I were doing it this way, I would probably still have to resort to this to make sure that I got it in. Just like that. You can, if you want to, make a stitch off the end of the point. I really never do that myself. I begin sewing just barely on the second side of the point. I bring my needle in here and I sew toward myself again, making sure that my stitches are closer together than they might normally be, because the point there has some bulk underneath it and you don't want your stitches to be too far apart. It's possible, because of where your thumb is, that you might end up with a little bit of a crease in the seam allowance here. And if you do, one of the best ways to deal with that is to reach underneath and just carefully turn under a little bit of the seam allowance at a time. If you do manage to turn under your seam allowance like this, let me see if we can make it do it. Yes, let's say you decide to be very enthusiastic about turning under your seam allowance. You want to turn under a lot. If you've got a little bit of a crease there, what you can end up with is a pleat. Let me pull the camera in. Now, it may not look like it will be that visible, but that little bump there really will show up in your applique. It's caused by the fabric folding over itself. Right there, you can see that. The best way to fix that sort of pleat is to reach into it. I like to use my toothpick for this. Smooth it open. In this case, I'm moving the fabric away from me. And then I'll come down here closer to my body and smooth the fabric out on this side of that pleat. What I'm doing is opening up the pleat, and as I do that, the outer edge of the applique smooths out, and the seam allowance on the underside of the applique also smooths out. Once you've stitched beyond the bulkiness at the point, go ahead and resume your normal stitch length. Happy stitching!